Thank you for having me speak, particularly Bob and Family First, at this wonderful event. I've been encouraged so much, and particularly in amongst such a high quality lineup of speakers, I'm truly honoured to be here. I also just want to be brave and greet you. Tiane kutu. Did I go okay? Now that we're friends, let's get started. So I'm going to talk about three main points today. And the first one is my story. The second one is that we're going to talk about, I've written there the Victorian Bill, but I've slightly adjusted that segment, but we're just going to be talking about the legislations that really the whole world is facing. And we're also going to be talking about our Free to Change project, which is a wonderful resource for everyone around the world to confidently talk about. And I'm not sure if you've received it in your packs, but there's a wonderful resource here, which is the Free to Change project. And if you haven't received it, you can either speak to Bob or be able to get hold of that somehow. But I'll be referring to that today. So while I share with you some insights from my life that I hope are helpful, I don't claim to have all the answers, as this topic is a very complex issue. And I think that should be an encouragement to all of us. Sometimes we don't feel the confidence because to engage in conversation because maybe we don't know all the answers. But I think it's okay to say, I don't know, I'll get back to you on that. And so I myself don't know all the answers to this complex topic. But it is my primary aim to speak today with utmost sensitivity and care, as this topic holds much emotion and deeply held convictions for many people. I also want to make it clear that I don't share my story with you today as a way to coerce anyone here to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. This is my story and my convictions that I've simply established along the way. As with most stories, it starts at the beginning. I was privileged to have been brought up in a stable, family-oriented Christian home. And I come from quite a large family, 6 kids, 3 girls, 3 boys. But I became pretty aware early on that I was rather different from my 2 other sisters, and from most girls in general. My interests grew more towards things that were stereotypically considered to be more boyish things. I loved the outdoors, sports, building things, fixing things, mowing lawns, you name it. And I probably still do today. But over time, I began to question my gender, and I wondered why I was a girl if I actually did all these things that boys typically did. Because I behaved and dressed very much like a boy, I was often mistaken as a boy. And that also added to my confusion and confirmation that I just felt so different. Thinking about where trending laws are taking us these days, and also considering the mainstream education that kids are provided, I'm certain that such influences would have fed into my confusion. And my thought pattern would have been ushered into thinking that I was probably a trans kid. I say this because I hear these trans kids describe how they are thinking and feeling, and it's exactly what I was thinking. And I guess it was sort of more casually going through my mind because it wasn't such a big deal, this whole trans thing back in my day, but they talk about exactly how I felt. Things like I felt uncomfortable with how my body was developing as a female. Feminine clothing seemed more of an inconvenience to me than a positive experience. Probably still does, a little bit too. I wanted to have short hair and wear hats all day while I worked in my dad's shed, playing with the tools. Looking back on it though, I know that this is not too much of an uncommon experience for many kids, particularly those within LGBT or ex-LGBT communities who more or less grow up feeling different from most kids. And so, like many others who experience this sort of figuring out of who they are, during their childhood development, my gender confusion actually began to dissipate over time. I began not only to accept, but then go on to embrace who God created me to be as a woman, and I still do today. In reality, my interests haven't changed, but my mindset has. So while my gender confusion dissipated, I began to realise that my same-sex attraction didn't dissipate. I tried to ignore these feelings away too and just hoped they'd go away. But in fact, they only grew stronger. So strong that I actually can't remember a time not feeling same-sex attracted, and so I can very much empathise with people who say that they feel they were born gay. After trying to resist these feelings for many years, it was through my early 20s that I entered into lesbian relationships. I'm not going to lie, for a time there, it was fulfilling. And the women I knew, they were generally great people. And I mean no disrespect to them in what I'm about to share today. But after some time going in and out of these relationships, I started to become pretty unhappy. I began to experience mental health struggles with severe anxiety, depression, loneliness, social isolation, sleeping difficulties, you name it. I also grew tired of the unhealthy relationships surrounding me. I disliked the promiscuity that were present in some relationships, as well as the obsessive nature. You may have heard about codependency. This was very present in many relationships. Now, this doesn't represent all lesbian relationships, but it was certainly my experience. And so for these reasons, as well as I will also say that faith was a big part of my reason, I really wanted to live according to what I believed was God's design for human sexuality. And so there was this real tension and wrestle within me. And so for these reasons, as well as other reasons as well, I decided to seek help in not only dealing with my mental health issues, but also support to leave the lesbian life. So I sought counsel. I sought counsel from psychologists and ministries, support networks, and people who had walked very similar roads to mine. For the record, none of these supports were ever harmful, coercive, or ineffective, as you hear from many lobbyists today. In fact, all these avenues of support were only ever very effective, supportive, and most importantly, they were driven by my desire to be actively involved in such counsel. So along my journey, I encountered two extremely contrasting experiences from two very different professionals. And one was a very negative experience, and one was a very positive experience. In fact, it was life-changing. So let's start with the first negative experience. And this was with a GP who responded to me with the affirmative model. During my visit, I explained to the GP that I wanted to see a psychologist just to talk through some personal issues I was going through. He didn't accept this as a satisfactory explanation. In fact, he continued to probe me to find out what these personal issues were. So I sort of reluctantly told him that I had this conflict within me between my same-sex attraction as well as how I wanted to live out my faith. He firstly mocked my God, and he mocked my faith, but then he told me that I should just live who I am and be a lesbian. It was actually humiliating and traumatic, because considering I was there to receive help to pursue a life away from lesbianism, his response actually made me feel rather unhelped and hopeless. According to this GP, my pursuit to explore this life of help, to explore this life away from lesbianism, not only was not valued, but apparently it wasn't possible. I left there wondering maybe my life would be like this forever. Now note, under the current legislation, as Bob mentioned, that the Victorian government has just passed, this is the only treatment that would legally be available, leaving people like me helpless. Now, contrast this experience with a Christian psychologist, and he took great care and concern and consideration for my pursuit. He listened, he asked questions, and he helped me unravel my past hurts and false beliefs about myself and others. He helped me recover from the pain of broken relationship. And then he provided me with the question about what life would look like on the other side of change. I couldn't answer him at first because I'd never contemplated my life without this all-consuming same-sex attraction. However, over the following weeks, hope began to grow. I began to imagine what my life would look like without this issue that was plaguing me and had plagued me for so many years. Before long, this hope started to become my new reality. And from then on, truth became a lot clearer. And I started to undo the lies that I had believed. Things like, maybe I was born gay. Things like not being able to trust other men. The counselling from the psychologist was simple. It didn't contain any sort of overly religious language, but it was very effective. I began to embrace my freedom to be who God created me to be. Not only in my own unique personality and interests, but also as a woman of God, intentionally created. And we see that in Psalm 139. God didn't make a mistake. His design was intentional. I also stopped defining myself by my sexuality and instead define myself by Christ's redeeming work on the cross to adopt me as his daughter. This was and still is the most freeing revelation that I've ever had. Identity can be such a grounding element in all our lives, can't it? And it determines our very core beliefs and emotions. And so for me, placing my identity and belonging back into Christ, it just changed everything. I grew and experienced healing when the word of God meant more to me than the words of men. Knowing the value and identity that I have in Christ meant that I didn't need to keep seeking and pursuing value and identity in relationships or my sexuality. Today, just 10 years on, I am living proof that change is possible. Not only in my sexual orientation, but I'm no longer having the mental health issues that I explained before. To name a few, I am free from the grip of anxiety, depression, self-doubt, and social isolation. My life is full of purpose, joy, and contentment. I'm happily married to a husband of 7 years, and we share our own biological children together, and I couldn't be happier. The road to change, it's not easy, and certainly not quick. In fact, I'm probably still travelling that road, but I've experienced more security, stability and happiness than I ever could have imagined. I'm so grateful that I had access and the freedom to pursue this life that I'm now living. If 10 years ago I was living under the current Victorian legislation, I would not have legally been able to pursue this life that I'm now living. For every step that was on my journey has now become illegal. Oh, I forgot the most important picture. Now, I was originally going to talk on this Victorian legislation, and I certainly will. But since then, I've sort of changed things around a bit, and I hope these slides sort of don't confuse you. I may skip over some, but in any case, it appears that now that this extreme bill in Victoria has been passed, it's sort of setting the benchmark across the world for them to also pass extreme draconian bills. And one thing is clear, that there is a wave coming around the world. In fact, it's a tidal wave that's actually already upon us, and it's sprung up very quickly. To clarify a few points, though, before we begin this section, I want to acknowledge that there are people who identify as LGBT and they're content with this. This presentation is not about denying or disregarding these people. I personally know people who identify as LGBT, and some are very good friends of mine. And we may disagree on other people, on these people's opinions on this topic, or they may disagree with me, but we still respect each other. And their opinions and their identities do not change how much I care for them. I have a real heart for this community. A bit slow on the slides. But also in light of the stories of people who have not experienced change or don't want to change, yet they do claim that they've subsequently been felt hurt and unacceptance from churches or religion, I do want to just briefly address this. I think for those of us upholding Christian or conservative values, we become so focused on winning our side of the debate, and we actually ignore the reality that whether we agree with it or not, there are people who are content as LGBT. We seem preoccupied in fixing their identity, and we've actually, without reaching the heart of the person. I want to acknowledge that the church has not always got this topic right. I think it first comes down to a lack of being equipped in how to deal with the LGBT community. But in some cases, it's actually been a terrible execution of the gospel. For society to hear that homosexual people will just go to hell, without hearing the fact that all sin separates us from God if it's not brought to Jesus, then they are only hearing a condemning gospel and a wrathful God. It's not the full gospel message, is it? And for a pastor to tell a gay man that he just needs to go and be intimate with a woman and then their same-sex attraction will be fixed is sadly a true story. It's not only beyond unhelpful, but it's fundamentally wrong. We as a broader church need to admit fault where there's been error, and we also need to get better at understanding and also ministering to this community. And in the same way that hospitals sometimes get things wrong, even though they are meant for good and for helping people, I've been on the receiving end of some bad medical treatment as well. But that doesn't mean that I give up on medical care altogether, does it? And so in the same way, churches or church members may have got it wrong and given out poor treatment to this community. But the church has an amazing ability to minister to this people, to such a group. And I've seen a lot of good happen in churches with this community. So let's get stuck into this legislation. This piece of legislation, the conversion therapy laws that are making its way around the globe, and the subsequent mantra that goes with it, is primarily based on the thought that change is impossible. Except, of course, if you're talking about the hormonal and surgical kind of change. Then, of course, you can change within the first consultation. But the Victorian Attorney General, Jill Hennessy from Victoria, she says there is no evidence sexual orientation or gender identity can be changed. Of course, if this idea that change is impossible is at the very foundation of your beliefs, then any effort to try and change, it would be not only useless but cruel. Wouldn't you agree? However, you've just heard my testimony and James' testimony, and you'll hear a lot more today. And we can tell you that change is possible. I'm not saying that change is only considered change if you marry the opposite sex. I'm talking about people who have pursued a life away from their LGBT identities and are much more content because of it. If lobbyists and politicians were to acknowledge that people have successfully walked away from LGBT lives on their own accord, then their ability to make such extreme laws would be harder to justify. But because they have convinced society that no one can change, and therefore any attempts to do so is bigoted quackery, as my state premier puts it, then no one is willing to question that statement. In the past 12 months, a team of us have spoken to many MPs and And we've tried to express to them that change is in fact possible and how this piece of legislation will in fact impact us, but also general society. Many MPs, they didn't want to speak to us despite our many attempts, but those who did meet with us had mixed responses. Some were very gracious and thankful for us sharing, and they were greatly impacted by it. Other politicians, well, they just politely listened, but we knew where they stood. We also attempted to speak on mainstream media, and we've heard a lot about mainstream media through TV, but also radio and newspapers. But we were very quickly shut down and blatantly ignored. One radio segment cut me off 3 sentences in, and when I called back, they said that I'd had my turn and that we need to hear the other side of the debate, despite them getting plenty of airtime. I'm not trying to have a whinge. In fact, it's actually exactly what I expected from mainstream media. I actually expect a lot worse. But these are the facts of how biased this debate is. The LGBT lobbyists, they seem to be stronger and louder, but they're also given the microphone, and we're not, except for today. They don't want our stories to become public because that would undermine their cause. It's interesting how the lobbyists play the victim card of being oppressed and suppressed, yet that's exactly what they're doing to us. This is just one of the many contradictions to their activism. So it's very difficult to engage in the conversation in the public square when our message is predominantly censored. Now, this type of censorship is not, it's not uncommon, but it's not just in Australia, it's worldwide, as we've just heard. And to speak of local examples, I hope I have my facts here correct, but I've been told that there was, on News Hub, I believe, on TV3 network, there was a 6-minute segment that was run by a journalist called Adam Hollingworth. I'm not sure if any of you know or saw it, but it was talking about it gave a balanced perspective on the increasing use of puberty blockers on transgender children. And Adams apparently received significant flack from all the lobbyists and all that, which again speaks to their intolerance for someone just providing a balanced perspective. One doctor was interviewed which saw no issues with prescribing the drugs, while an American paediatrician gave another perspective, warning the potential harms that can come from puberty blockers. And if I was New Zealand folk, I might be thinking, well, why does such a perspective have to come from the US? Where are our New Zealand doctors speaking up against this? Well, the fact is that there are people in the medical profession in New Zealand who are very concerned about the medicalisation of children and the experimentation of kids with these drugs, but they too are being silenced and feel too intimidated to speak. I know of a New Zealand healthcare professional who attempted to speak out. I was given permission to share this statement as they want you to know what is happening in your own country. So I quote, "I recently got the opportunity to debate the affirmative care model of gender therapy at a meeting with my doctor's organisation. But before the debate took place, the doctor who was to debate me was not only declined, but she had me shut down completely on the issue. I was called to a meeting with senior management at the medical centre and told I was not to present on this topic at all, or there would be a complaint to my registering body and I may lose my livelihood. It was a clear example of intimidation and threat. They told me I was not to present on the published evidence to anyone in my professional capacity. I felt as if I had been visited by gangsters. Gender ideology has really taken hold in my country and it is very creepy and sinister." End quote. I spoke to this person and they are very courageous. And unfortunately, it's going to take a lot more courageous people to stand up to this tidal wave that is going to completely change our society if we don't do anything. Know that many medical professionals are concerned. So friends, take heart, be encouraged, and be empowered to engage in conversation on this issue. Don't be silenced out of intimidation. Don't just leave it to Family First to speak out on these issues. This person I just quoted to you believes that this is actually going to be the voice of the people that will affect some change in this area, not just the medical professionals. Be resilient in your schools and fight for wholesome education for your children. Be resilient in your families and protect your children. There is not a better time than now to stick our heads out all together. Yes, we'll cop flack, absolutely. But we've got to do this to respond to the gross sexualisation and medicalisation of children. Now, obviously, I went on a bit of a transgender tangent there, and I think Elizabeth covered that topic very well. So I'm going to sort of get back to the conversion therapy laws. And just to cover my bases, I just want to quickly recap what it actually covers, even though I'm sure many of you know. These laws aim to prohibit any attempt to change or suppress someone's sexual orientation or gender identity, whether it be a psychologist, religious leader, school teacher, parent, family member, or any layperson even participating in informal conversation. Such attempts are called conversion therapy. And conversion therapy is actually only a term I've ever heard of in regard to legislation. I've never actually heard of it when I was pursuing help and support in my own journey. So it's really interesting how these terms come up. We know that conversion therapy, the definition is intentionally broad. It not only captures sort of helpful support and therapy that I've explained to you that I received, but it also captures harmful practices that actually no one condones. And this is sort of the whole con in all of this. Let's be clear that abhorrent practices such as ice baths, electroshock therapy, aversion therapies, they should absolutely be banned. In fact, they actually already are. But forcing someone to participate in these kinds of therapies against their will is fundamentally wrong. Let's just put that all out. But if you read between these lines of the legislations, it's actually not just targeting these abhorrent practices. Like I said, these practices, they're just no longer practiced today, and if they were practiced by psychiatrists, not by religious organisations like the lobbyists claim. So under the guise and drama of banning abhorrent practices, the bill actually has much more concerning detail. And I was going to run through quite a few steps, but I actually think Bob's covered the concerning issues quite well in this, which you would have received in your pamphlet today. So I'm just going to cover a couple of the main ones that I'm concerned with. The first one is that, and probably what is most impacting in this legislation, this is the Victorian legislation, by the way, not New Zealand, is that it specifies that any practice that is conducted towards a person is whether with or without consent. This is the phrase in this clause that holds so much concern for all of us. So in that statement alone, we've taken away a person's right and freedom to access the support and treatment that they consent to. The government is stepping on our so-called free society and dictating what we can or cannot have access to. We see here how this actually affects Sarah. The change she is in pursuit of, by her own free will, is being shockingly denied. I mentioned that we spoke to some MPs last year as part of our campaign, and there were a number of them, namely Labor and independent MPs, who said they were really impacted by our stories, but evidently this was your classic political dribble. I know this because their comments later in Parliament on the day of the vote made this clear. You see, amendments were put forward by other MPs who knew our stories, and they were advocating for amendments to the bill so that those who consented to therapy were able to get that. But the Labor MPs rejected the proposed amendments by responding that such people were clearly brainwashed and delusional. Now, ironically, Had these comments been directed at LGBT people, this would have been claimed as hate speech and discrimination, wouldn't it? Very hurtful. Jill Hennessy, again, this lady I mentioned, Victorian Attorney General, she also mentioned in her statement to Parliament that the conversion therapy definition does not allow people to consent to change or suppression practices, which recognises the insidious nature of the inherent power imbalances involved in such practices and ensures the most vulnerable are properly protected. Now, I don't remember any power imbalance that I experienced when I actively sought counsel and support. So as this bill stands, this clause relating to consent means that only those who embrace their identity as LGBT have the right to self-determination, no one else. I'm going to talk about harm, which I think Professor Paul spoke a little bit on this morning, but I think it's a really valuable point. The bill often refers to harm, the harm that is caused towards LGBT people, but it fails to define what the harm actually is. And Melbourne University has raised concerns, I'll just skip to there, with one of the courses on feminism. A complaint was made in relation to this subject when a lecturer dared to ask women to detail how their experience of female bathrooms has been impacted by the inclusion of trans women. The university is now considering a gender affirmation policy. And the Chancellor of the university, told the staff that the academic freedom to pursue questions concerning transgender identity had to be balanced with the damage and harm that our transgender colleagues experience from the questions being pursued. Someone by the name of James McPherson wrote a fascinating article in response to this university's policy, where he detailed the effects that this undefined harm has caused. He writes, "What constitutes harm is not clear, which of course is part of the evil geniuses of such policies. The woolly nature of the offence is deliberate so that people who cannot possibly know if they are likely to be in violation of the policy will self-censor." This is already happening, folks. We're already questioning what we can or cannot say. And the law actually isn't in place yet. Sadly, I'm going to quickly move along because I've only got 11 minutes, but these Australian legislations are based on apparent research undertaken by the La Trobe University. This paper made conclusions from interviewing a grand total of 15 participants. Now, not only was the participant number extremely low, but the research only included anecdotal evidence. No data, no statistics, just interviews from people who mocked the very support that people like me participated in and benefited from. It's staggering that the Australian legislation has been heavily influenced by the paper that is upheld as so-called science, yet it contains significant flaws. The La Trobe University apparently has run now a second study, and it's of note that after engaging an LGBT advocacy group, after partnering with Macquarie University, after receiving funding from the Victorian government, and searching for a second year, it produced only another 20 people. So between the two studies that was run over 2 years, they have only found 35 people who are willing to testify against conversion therapy. And they still supply no statistics or comprehensive data to prove that the therapy that they are trying to ban is actually harmful. So let's talk about free to change. And as you're aware, there are people who identify as LGBT, but this bill actually makes it illegal for people to have freedom to change. It's bringing a very unbalanced perspective to this debate. So a couple of years ago, we embarked on a study aiming to bring balance. And this is the book that I hope you get your hands on today. I understand that... skip over that. If I can draw your attention to page 4 of this book, and it details 4 critical aspects that the study explored. It explored whether you can actually change your sexual orientation or gender identity. It explored whether such change was beneficial. It explored whether counselling was used. And it explored whether change was in fact long-lasting. We compiled many stories and quality data from 78 participants. And I will add that it only took 6 months for us to gain 78 people. Quite a big effort, considering La Trobe's small numbers. We have had no external funding, no big organisation or university to promote our study, and no government supporting us. Note also on page 5 of the book where it talks about how we carefully considered the verifying and authenticating the participants. So every participant had to register with their name and a point of contact. Every participant could, as an option, nominate an alias name, and this was to protect their identity. Each participant was authentically verified by a staff member of ex-LGBT ministries, and this was to ensure that we had no made-up stories. The study obtained statistical data, unlike La Trobe's anecdotal evidence, and 33 out of the 78 people chose to upload their testimonies as in addition to the survey. And you can go and read them on our website, which I'll have up soon. So let's just quickly look at the data. Some of my graphs will also be different to what's in the book, but it's all the same results and data. This graph reveals the percentage of participants that used the very counselling and support systems that they're trying to ban. Many of the participants also specifically reported the use of prayer, and you'll see James's quote that James is the man who you saw in the video before. And this is specifically made illegal in the Victorian Bill. And wouldn't you agree that prayer and these support services have made such a big impact in these people's lives? So the overwhelming majority of those who left their LGBT lives used the very counselling and support services that the government has now banned. So what benefits did they gain from such counselling? Well, this data shows that suicidal ideation, anxiety and promiscuity were all significantly reduced. And self-image, relationships and physical health have all significantly increased. And of the total participants, most of them are living in heterosexual relationships, which, as I mentioned earlier, marriage is not the end primary goal, but it still marks significant change. And most detransitioners no longer suffer from gender dysphoria. Change is possible. Now, a common argument you'll hear against these results tell you that people who claim to leave their LGBT lives, they'll always go back to them. And sure, there are some who do. But our results reveal that 70% of those who left their identities over 10 years ago, left their LGBT lives over 10 years ago, many of them 20 or 30 years ago. So all these results, they can be found very freely on our website, freetochange.org. One of the tabs you can click on, which brings you to the LGBT stories, ex-LGBT stories of the 33 people I mentioned. And many other stories, again, can be found on other websites like Changed Movement and Two Prisms. So these stories clearly show the following: that suicides were averted, many changed their orientation, professional and religious counselling were very much used, and that the changes are long-standing. While 78 people bravely shared their experience, we know there are so many more. Many, in fact, are actually sitting in your church congregations unnoticed. Many are also people who don't have a faith, but they just chose to leave their LGBT lives. I personally know people who are not willing to come forward because of fear of family finding out, fear for their career, and the impact and fear of the damage to their personal reputation. And these are clearly understandable reasons, but their changed lives are still valid and very important. So, to conclude, this is a very complex issue, and I know I've sort of talked a lot, but we've only just scratched the surface. And no matter where you sit on this topic, I hope you agree with me that it's of great importance that we get the balance of these legislations right. And we need to get them right so that all peoples have the right to self-determination. When it's acknowledged that change is in fact possible, it sheds new light on these harmful legislations that are founded on an ideology where truth is actually absent. I'll say it one last time. Change is possible. Thank you.